In this video, we're going to show you everything you need to know about XLR cable for audio and DMX cable for lighting. At first glance, they look very similar, but there are a lot of differences. You may be tempted to switch one cable for another, and you might not know what types of problems that you're creating by doing that. In some cases, you can do it in a pinch, and in other cases, it's a big no-no that's going to create you a lot of problems, and we're going to cover all that in this video. Now, what if you are working at a large event with a ton of audio cable and a ton of lighting cable? We're also going to cover tips, tricks, and strategies that the big companies use to keep these two technologies separate so you don't accidentally plug a microphone into your lighting equipment or a light into your audio system. And we're going to cover all that in detail as well. Now, if you are looking to buy XLR cable or DMX cable, we do have some links down in the description below with a complete buyer's guide for each type of cable, and we also show you what cables we use in our studio here at Kettner Creative. Before we get into the cables themselves, we need to cover a couple things at the beginning. First of all, if you hear me talking about an XLR connector, I'm talking about the actual physical connector at the end of the cable. If you hear me say XLR cable, then I'm talking about an audio cable with an XLR connector. DMX cable will typically have an XLR connector on it, but I'll be referring to any lighting cables as DMX cables and any audio cables as XLR cables. Next, let's quickly talk about the connector. A lot of people are surprised to find out that it is literally the same connector on each, and there are no hard and fast rules about whether or not lighting or audio uses a 3-pin, 4-pin, or 5-pin XLR connector. On the audio side, a 3-pin XLR connector is by far the most common, but it's not uncommon to find a 4-pin XLR connector used for things like clearcom or communications, and a 5-pin XLR connector can be used for binaural recording devices or stereo mic setups or something like that. On the lighting side, a 3-pin DMX connector is typically used by more DJ-related low-end lighting. I'd say a lighting fixture under $500. It will probably have a 3-pin XLR connector. The official DMX spec uses a 5-pin XLR connector, but the outer pins on that connector aren't wired to anything. Typically, if you buy a 5-pin XLR connector, it will only have 3 pins soldered to that XLR connector. The fourth and fifth pin were actually created for future expansion, but as technology evolved, people just started using technologies like ArtNet or SACN or something like that instead of using more data on your DMX connector. So the connector itself isn't a giveaway on which cable you're using because both audio and lighting cables will use a 3-pin, 4-pin, or 5-pin XLR connector. So how do you actually tell the difference of what cable you're using? You need to look at the cable that you have, and typically you will find printing on the sleeve of it with the brand, the spec, and it'll say DMX 512 or something like that if it's for lighting. On the audio side, it'll typically say XLR cable or XLR Pro audio cable or Pro audio cable with the brand and the spec and the resistance that's on the cable. So if you are trying to tell the difference, you need to read the fine print that's on the cable part itself and don't look at the connector. Okay, first of all, let's talk about what an XLR cable is and the specs and how it's different from a DMX cable and that spec. So on an XLR cable, it's made for a wide range of analog audio signals. If you think about a really quiet microphone like the Shure SM7B, there's a diaphragm that's attached to a coil and it catches sound waves moving through the air and it reacts with a magnet to generate a tiny analog electrical signal. Now that might be as quiet as minus 60 dB, and then it goes to your audio mixer, and you can use another XLR cable at line level, which is 0 dB or plus 4 dB. So there's a wide range of analog audio signals that an XLR cable can handle. An XLR cable is balanced, so theoretically you could run an analog audio signal up to 1,000 feet without audio degradation or anything like that. Now the actual impedance of the cable itself will vary by manufacturer, but the XLR cables that you'll find off the shelf will typically be between 45 and 75 ohms or something like that. Again, this is to deal with an analog audio signal. A couple other things that I've noticed with dealing with all the XLR cables that we have here is that they are typically more flexible than a DMX cable, and they're built more ruggedly. You can, carry them, pull them, wind them a lot better. They're meant to be beat up on stage a lot more by musicians and that type of thing than maybe a DMX cable is. Next, let's talk about how a DMX cable works. A DMX audio signal, unlike XLR, is actually a digital signal. Each DMX cable can carry 512 channels. Each one of those 512 channels can carry a value of between 0 and 255. So if you push a fader up from 0 to 100%, that value will go from 0 to 255 to control a lighting fixture or a parameter on that lighting fixture. Now, in order to accommodate this digital signal, the DMX system has a very tight spec. We talked about how the XLR audio cables would be between 45 and 75 ohms, depending on the manufacturer, what they're trying to do with the cable. Well, the DMX spec is tightly conformed to 110 ohms. So if you operate outside of that, then you can expect to get some errors, and maybe you'll lose some data or have more inaccurate data across your digital channels that you're trying to control. What does that actually mean? We're going to talk about this a little bit more in more detail, but if you use an XLR audio cable for lighting, your lighting fixtures will act erratic, be unresponsive, and harder to control. You might experience just strobing lighting fixtures that you have no control over if you use an improper cable or if you use a DMX cable that's not at 110 ohms. Another thing that I want to point out about DMX cable, typically they're run around the stage, they're run across lighting truss or something like that. They're really not as rugged. Again, I always think of them like Ethernet cable in terms of their sensitivity. You don't want to be driving carts over any cable really, but especially DMX cable. I find they're a lot more temperamental to their environment and abuse and like rigors of the road. The more you use them, the more they do break down. They do break down and you have to take better care of them than XLR cable in my experience. Okay, now the question that everybody wants to know, can you use an XLR cable for lighting? So say you're a DJ, you have a big sound system, you're getting into, you're expanding into lighting, and you think, hey, it has the same connector on it, will this work? As I explained earlier, you cannot use an XLR audio cable for lighting. You might get away with it once, but I've been burned by this when I was just getting started 10 or 15 years ago, and I could not figure it out for the life of me. You will get flickering fixtures, you'll have all kinds of problems, they'll be way more temperamental. And the thing with lighting that's really, really frustrating is if you have 10 lighting fixtures and they're all daisy chained with XLR cable, fixture 9 might be flickering and it's due to a bad cable before fixture 3. So it's really hard to troubleshoot. This is why I always recommend going with a high quality, proper DMX cable in order to use lighting. If you don't, it's just going to drive you crazy and you'll have problem after problem after problem. Further, if you're setting this up at an event, during your setup, sound check, and test, the symptoms might not show itself right away. I promise you, if you use an XLR cable for lighting, it will hurt you at the most embarrassing time. I've done this for a wedding once when I was first getting started. Everything was absolutely perfect. And then once the room filled with people, lights started flickering, and I went insane trying to figure it all out. So don't make the same mistake I made when I was getting started. Use proper DMX cables for DMX lights. Now, what if you're in an absolute pinch and you have a bunch of extra DMX cable at an event and you need to connect an extra microphone or something like that to your sound system? You can do that, and I've done this in a pinch. For all the same reasons I've mentioned before, I wouldn't recommend it, but an analog audio signal, like what comes from a microphone, is a lot more tolerant to a wider range of impedance, so you can use a DMX cable for audio if you're absolutely in a pinch. I wouldn't do this on anything that's mission critical for a lead singer or anything like that. If you had to do this, I would use it on a channel that's for backup or not highly used or not mission critical to the event that you're working on, but it can be done, and I've never had a problem using DMX cable in an audio application. Now, what happens if you're running a full-size stage, you have an audio team and a lighting team? How do these people keep everything separate? There's a couple things that they do. First of all, if you look at the outputs on either lighting console, you'll notice that an analog audio output has a male XLR connector and an analog lighting output has a female XLR connector. So all of the cables should be backwards. If you have a stage box on the stage with all your lighting and audio cables, the female XLR connectors should be for lighting and the male XLR connectors should be for audio. Now, there are some other tips and tricks as well. We used to work a lot with Christie Lights, for example. They'll use green and purple DMX cable, like the actual shielding on the cable instead of being black will be green, or purple, and that'll separate the 3-pin and 5-pin DMX cables that are on site. And generally on site, every audio cable should be black just because they're on stage and it looks better. But with lighting cables, you can get a little bit more colorful with the actual cable itself because they're typically not featured on camera. They're run much more discreetly around the stage or up in the truss or in the ceiling or something like that. I hope this video is helpful. Again, if you are looking for a buyer's guide for which actual cables we recommend buying and our experience working with each cable, we do have links down in the description below. If you have any questions or comments or something that I didn't cover in this video, please leave a comment down below. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.